primary season, and Senator Bernie Sanders keeps campaigning despite more disappointing finishes. Plus, coronavirus dominates the headlines. We're grading responses all on Tennessee This Week. Hello and welcome to Tennessee This Week. I'm Blake Stevens. We're a few weeks out from Super Tuesday now. It was never in doubt on the Republican side of the ballot. President Donald Trump taking the vast majority of the GOP primaries. On the Democratic side, Knoxville seeing a couple visits from primary hopefuls like former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg and Senator Amy Klobuchar, but now they're out of the running. And while it isn't set in stone with the more recent Big Tuesday vote, the November presidential matchup is starting to come into focus. Well, last week we heard from local Democratic Party leader. Today we're turning to the other side of the aisle to talk about these recent votes and the races ahead. So this is Randy Pace, chairman of Knox County's Republican Party. Thanks for joining us, Randy.
Blake, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Even threw on a suit and tie for us, so thanks for that.
You know, you got to dress for the job that you want. So generally it's T-shirt and blue jeans, but hey.
Hey, thanks for making an exception. Well, we're taping on Thursday night, and at this point, Senator Sanders is still in the race against former Vice President Joe Biden, despite more wins for the former Vice President last Tuesday. So, Randy, I want to ask you, what do you think about a potential Trump-Biden matchup, and would you have preferred Senator Sanders be the opponent? Actually,
I don't have a preference for the Democrat primary. I vote in the Republican primary, and Trump is our nominee. I believe President Trump is going to prevail regardless who the nominee is on the Democrat side.
So you don't see one of the Democrats over the other being a harder challenger for your guy?
No, not at all. I think both of them represent a portion of their constituency, and I think at the end of the day, that's going to have probably a negative impact regardless who it is.
Well, let's talk about the former Vice President and Senator Sanders. Joe Biden won, but it was a close race with Bernie Sanders here in Knox County. We get those numbers back up. You see 32 to 32 there, just a few hundred votes separating the two. What do you think that says about us as a community, especially when you look at the city? Do you think it says possibly further leaning to the left than some might realize? What did you make from those results?
So there were a number of candidates on the ballot, and I think everybody knew going in you were going to have two top-tier candidates as the race moved forward, and it wasn't any secret that both of these gentlemen were going to be those candidates. What did the vote totals say about Knox County? I think Knox County is similar to the rest of the nation. I don't think that any of the other candidates were polling or pulling numbers nationwide that, you know, says anything different than what we're seeing in Knox County. If you break it down to the district level in Knox County, yeah, the city is much bluer than the rest of the county, but just by numbers, when you're talking a general election, you know, it's going to be hard to overcome for the Democrats.
So no surprises for you, though, in terms of how Tuesday night went. Okay, so what is your message on the Republican side? What's that message going to be locally for the president as we head closer to the general?
So there was a lot of talk about the number of votes cast in the primary, and the Democrats came out en masse. They had a whole lot more to choose from, and I think that both Sanders and Biden excited people a lot more, and they wanted their guy. So certainly, you know, there were 3 names on the ballot for the Republican primary, and 2 of them got less than 3% between the 2 of them. Trump's the nominee, or President Trump's the nominee. What I want to tell voters in Knox County, Republican voters, all voters for that matter, you know, take a look at where we're at. What makes the most sense right now, particularly with, you know, what's going on throughout the world with coronavirus. It just, we need a steady hand. We need somebody that you know, is not going to show up and upset the apple cart. You know, things started out slowly, but I think we're on track, and I don't want to see any changes. And I think the people in Knox County, as upset as a lot of them are, you know, the general election's a long way off, and by the time we get there, I think they're going to be ready for that steady hand on the wheel.
And so you're going to hit on some of those successes, some of the high points over the last 4 years. I think we may be one of those rough patches here, whether you attribute that to the president or just Mother Nature. But how do you view the president's handling of the coronavirus from where we are?
So if you go back to December, the amount of information and what was coming out of China as far as what was actually happening, you know, I'm not certain China wanted to share the information. I think the president at that time, going back to December and the early part of January, was focused on, you know, what was in the best interest of the United States first and the world second. Certainly he can't control what goes on inside of China, but everything within his control and everything that he did subsequent to that initial notification, based on the information China was providing, I think was spot on. The idea that somehow the president did or didn't do something necessary to protect the country from coronavirus, we can gnash our teeth all day long about what did or didn't happen. I don't sit in Washington, D.C. I can only base it on the press releases that the White House does, the press releases the CDC does,
right,
and
right.
less gossip, less what I see on the internet.
But I'm specifically asking about response. So it's here, it's in more than 40 states at this point. Do you approve of the handling of the already economic impact of it in terms of more testing, the different proposals that the president has laid out, his primetime address to the nation? Do you approve of that handling of the virus?
So again, based on the type of virus, based on what we're facing and the rapid expansion of the infection going from person to person, a couple of days ago it wasn't in 40 states, it was in 13 states. So it's happening rapidly. The response, like I said, I think is spot on. What would we do differently? And I'm not certain that who's sitting in the White House right now has much to do with how rapidly it has
You feel
spread.
that some may be giving undue credit or undue criticism to the White House. Okay, so back to locally. Locally, your party had a busy primary, 6 contested races here in the county. I mean, you guys had while you didn't have a real presidential primary on the ballot, no real contenders, you had a lot of local races. Were you proud to see that many Republicans on the ballot?
All right, so I'm going to run through the numbers. I'm very happy that we had, you know, as many contested Republican primary races that we did. I think when you put more heads together and more eyes on it, you end up with a better product. There are 28 elected races that impact Knox County voters this year in 2020, starting with the primaries, moving to the county general and the state primaries, and then on to the state general and federal general elections in November. There were 76 candidates in total for those 28 offices. County and state, there were 56. There are 45 now as a result of the primary. 26 of them Republicans, 15 Democrats, 5 independents, and 10 nonpartisan. Those were the school board races.
And one of those contested races, I've got about 20 seconds left. Tennessee has another contested Republican primary for Senate. Now, President Trump has endorsed, of course, Bill Hagerty, his pick for that seat. Do you think other candidates should step aside, or do you think there's a healthy number in the race so far?
Well, right now, my understanding, we're looking at about 6 candidates in that race. I think 2 of them are top tier. Dr. Manny Sethi and Bill Hagerty, Ambassador Bill Hagerty, are the top tier candidates. The rest of the candidates, polling-wise, what they can reasonably expect to pull in an election, between all the other candidates, you're looking at maybe 5%. Do they need to get out? No, it's not my call during a primary to decide who gets to run. if you want to wear the Republican Party banner, we have rules that guide that, but if somebody wants to pull a petition and run for Senate, President, you know, they're welcome to do it. I think everybody should run for public office at one time or another. It's an experience, and we all need to step up our game when it comes to civic engagement.
Step up our game when it comes to civic engagement. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining us.
Blake, glad to be here.
All right, thank you. Still to come, our panel of pundits talk about the road to November and coronavirus. The nation scrambles to deal with that scare. You're watching Tennessee This Week on WATE, 6 on your side.
Hello, I'm Mike Hatmaker. Spring Special 2018 Jeep Wrangler Unlimited Golden Eagle Edition. All the equipment, sale price $29,888, and you get $1,000 worth of gift cards. So hurry into Jim Carr Dodge Chrysler Jeep Ram.
As Murbros, we're always trying to be our best selves. And with their new fish sticks and fillets, Gordon's is at its best too. Ridiculously fresh tasting.
So perfect.
Trust the Gordon's fishermen.
I'm truly amazed at the effect that it has on people.
Hello, I'm Mike Hatmaker. Want a deal on the truck? This is it. 2016 Ram 2500 Diesel Crew Cab Laramie Longhorn 4x4. Sale price $49,888. So hurry in to Jim Carr Dodge Chrysler Jeep Ram.
Every day, we're out here telling your stories.
Everybody has an ability to achieve something great.
Local stories about life, community, the Tennessee spirit, and the rhythm behind what makes this such an amazing place to call home.
Amazing things come from amazing people.
We're on your side, here to help by focusing on the needs and concerns of East Tennessee. We've been a part of your community for more than 65 years.
For everyone and for everything East Tennessee, thanks for watching WATE 6 on your side.
Hey, welcome back to Tennessee This Week. Well, it's time to hear from our panel of pundits. Joining us today is 6 on your side healthcare analyst Craig Griffith, attorney and former Senate candidate Terry Adams, and 6 on your side political analyst George Corda. All right, the desk is clean. We are...
Wipe down.
We're in DEFCON 1 right here.
Right. Yeah, better safe than sorry. All right, well, let's talk about the matchup. Right now, Trump versus Biden. Things are certainly looking to be in that direction, rather than Trump versus Senator Sanders. I want to ask you all, does this change the president's odds? And, you know, what do you make of that potential matchup? Craig, we'll start with you.
Well, first of all, there's still a lot of Democratic delegates out there to be garnered, so I'm not so sure that this primary race is over yet. So we'll have to see. Certainly, Senator Sanders doesn't seem to be doing as well as he did in 2016 in a number of states, but there's still a long way to go on that. So, you know, I don't know which candidate. It seems that the president said that he would rather run against the communist, Bernie Sanders, than against Biden. So we'll have to see how this works out.
But so far in the race, you don't feel comfortable with that hypothetical Biden-Trump matchup to say how that goes?
Well, I'll just say what I've always said. 2016 was one of the closest presidential races that we've had in our country. 70,000 voters in 3 Midwestern states flipped the Electoral College to Trump, and that's why he won. And I think that we are now in just as strong a silos as we were in 2016. And the president hasn't expanded his base to any great degree. So I think it's going to be very close again.
George, how do you see a Biden-Trump matchup?
I think Trump will do better in 2020 than he did in 2016. And I think part of it is the Sanders effect. I think the Sanders cost, the price Sanders is going to want for support is a party that has been going left, going even farther left. So that's going to be an issue for Biden. The coronavirus is an issue, yeah. But once it starts to subside, which it will, which it inevitably will, then the question becomes for voters, was Trump responsible for this international outbreak or not? And the far left is going to say, absolutely, he was responsible for not responding properly. And the right is going to say, he did everything he could have done. This was a worldwide issue. And then the people in the middle are going to have to decide whether they agree with one or agree with the other. I thought if the economy, stock market went down, it would be just incredibly damaging for Trump. However, if the rest of the world were sitting out there not having to deal with this, and the United States was going through it, then yes, I think Trump would still be in desperate trouble. But it's not that way. I think this is not the factor that's going to deal him a losing hand.
And we're going to talk more about the coronavirus here in a minute, but we'll pose that same question to you, the Trump-Biden possibility. What do you make of that race?
Well, I think that that's not the race that Trump wanted to run. I think certainly he thought that a far more left candidate like Bernie Sanders was somebody that he could beat, because he thought that he could get closer to the center and pull a lot of those independents and nonpartisan kind of people. I will say that to George's point, what we know about electoral politics and presidential races is that incumbents have a huge, huge advantage unless the economy is not running well. So whatever happens between now and November is what's going to determine that election. We can't say what's going to happen now, because we don't know what the coronavirus is going to do. We know it's being filmed on Thursday. We know that the cards have fallen and the dominoes have fallen, I mean, so quickly that we can't predict that. But I can tell you this, that the idea that Biden is the presumptive candidate, I think is wrong. I mean, we have a debate on Sunday night, and to be honest with you, Biden has not been great in debates. Can Bernie Sanders pull off an Elizabeth Warren on Sunday night? If he can, then he's right back in the race.
Well, you know, the debates have been very interesting. I mean, Warren did eviscerate Bloomberg in that debate. And so you're going to have a debate here with no audience, which is going to be a different factor as well. So I think that, you know, the interesting dynamics between this primary was that Democratic voters from the beginning, from Iowa, were looking for somebody else, someone younger, someone, you know, with some fresh thoughts, which is why they went for Buttigieg. And they've been searching for that person, and they found Joe Biden with 2 feet in the coffin outside of the state limits of South Carolina. And South Carolina resurrected him from a fate, you know, of someone putting the nails in that coffin. So it's an unusual circumstance.
What's going to happen is Bernie Sanders, Biden's been getting confused lately. He's been saying a lot of things that don't make sense.
Not any less than the president has. So I'm going to say that right now.
I'm not talking about the president right now, Craig.
Really?
I'm talking about Joe Biden and the upcoming debate. And here's what's going to happen. Sanders is going to go after him. And he is going to try to get him to say something like, I'm running for the U.S. Senate, or popping off like he did to that voter, where he cursed out that voter the other day. He's going to try to get Biden. This is like a fight. And they're coming up with strategies to try to force the other one to show their weaknesses. And Biden has a greater potential to show weakness than Sanders.
Well, but Sanders has not been the kind of person that would attack another candidate. He attacks issues, but he doesn't attack other candidates.
Well, Terry, that brings me to my next question. Point taken that the primary is not over, although the vice president has some major leads in some major states and some big looking good in the polls down the road.
Sure.
But it's not over, so my question to you three would be, can Senator Sanders turn things around? And if he doesn't, do you see his message and Senator Warren's message on the Biden platform coming up later this summer?
Yeah, I think that is a very, very tough call. I think, and you know, the way that we grade that is, you know, who's going to be the vice presidential nominee. I think that it's almost certainly going to be somebody that's female. Is it going to be a Klobuchar or Kamala Harris, or is it going to be a senator from Massachusetts? You know, I think that's you know, the way that that's played is really going to lay out the groundwork for how enthusiastic the Democratic base is going to be about this election.
We've got to split up about 50 seconds here. George, what do you think?
I think the farther left the Democratic Party goes, and they'll have to go farther left, I mean, Biden has said a lot of things in this campaign that he has never believed before on various issues. They're much farther to the left than he's been before. He understands, and his campaign understands, that's where the base is. But the base, see, back during the 2016 election, I was speaking to the Farragut Rotary Club, and somebody asked me a question about Trump and blue states. I said, I think Trump has a better chance to flip blue states red than Clinton does to do the opposite. I think Trump, if whoever the nominee is for the Democrats, has a better chance to flip more blue states, depending on the economy.
Craig, got 25 seconds.
Well, you know, the economy is in a free fall right now. So I think that the only thing that you can say that's going to come out of this whole is that there's going to be a recession. Now the question is, how long is that recession going to last, and is there a strong recovery in November? And we'll have to see how that plays out.
All right, on that note, that's going to lead us into our next segment coming up here. Still to come, coronavirus concerns boiling over. We'll talk about whether leaders are handling that situation well. You're watching Tennessee This Week from WATE, 6 on your side.
Hello, my cat makers. Spring special 2019 Jeep Wrangler, hardtop, automatic, air, all the equipment, sale price $30,888, and you get $1,000 with gift cards. So hurry in now to Jim Dodge Chrysler Jeep Ram.
If you're new to Medicare, because you're turning 65 or recently retired, you can still get affordable and complete coverage with a Cigna Medicare Advantage plan and get treated like more than just a number, because Cigna treats you like a whole person, body and mind. Get more coverage for less. Call 1-855-984-1321. With Cigna, you get medical, dental, vision, and prescriptions in one plan. A team of doctors for your overall health and healthy living programs to save you money. Plus, no primary doctor copay and only a $5 specialist copay. If you're new to Medicare, you can still get affordable coverage for the whole you from Cigna, no matter your health status. Don't wait. Call now to get your free Medicare Advantage guide. Call 1-855-984-1321. That's 1-855-984-1321. Or visit GetCignaMedicare.com. Cigna, together all the way.
Hello, my cat maker. It's the final days of our Wrangler write-down. Showroom special, Jeep Wrangler Unlimited, discounted $6,000. 2019 Wranglers from $28,888, and you get $1,000 worth of gift cards. So hurry into Jim Dodge Chrysler Jeep Ram.
Conversations going on now with Craig Griffith, Terry Adams, and George Corda. All right, the coronavirus, we were talking about it a little bit in the break. I want to first ask, how is Tennessee handling this situation right? And then what about the White House, Craig?
Well, I think Tennessee has gotten off to a good start with Governor Lee declaring the declaration of emergency to free up things to handle it. They had a little hiccup in the road by not wanting to identify which counties that the viruses were found in. They just wanted to do it in the grand divisions. But public health crises like this are handled at the local level. Dr. Buchanan over at the Knox County and her health department and her counterparts around the state have been planning for issues like this for years. But of course, you know, that old famous military saying, you know, a plan never survives contact with the enemy. So you have to adjust on the run, and I think that the local health departments are doing that. So, you know, on the federal level, have been hiccups in the response. There's been hiccup in responses to hurricanes. There's been hiccups in responses to other natural disasters. So you're going to have problems with this. But, you know, I think that after the speech on Wednesday that the president gave and the stock market went down as much as it had since the biggest loss since 1987, Black Monday. So I think that there are many people that are criticizing the way the federal government has handled this response.
Do you think it could have been handled differently, thus affecting the markets differently?
Yes, I think there are things that they could have done in the beginning that would have helped. They could have said, no, let's not do the food stamp reduction that they're planning in April, kicking off 1 million people off of food stamps when we're going to be in a food crisis. Let's get more grants to the community health center that Congress has refused to approve. So those are going to be the frontline places that people are going to go for help.
George, I see you cooking there.
Well, that would have kept the stock market is falling. Market Watch did an analysis of this. The top 3 reasons the stock market are falling. Number 1 is coronavirus, because it's affecting China, it's affecting Europe, it's affecting manufacturing centers and purchasing centers. So that doesn't have a bloody thing to do with Donald Trump. Number two is fear of Bernie Sanders. That Bernie Sanders' influence, his left-wing socialist influence, is going to get into the Democratic platform and affect the markets.
Now, he's had 2 bad nights recently.
Well, and another one is the collapse in oil prices. So, and there are some others after that. So there's a confluence of events that are occurring that don't have a blessed thing to do with what Donald Trump did or didn't do.
What Donald Trump has claimed for the last 3 years is that the stock market has gone up because of what he has done. He is single-handedly responsible for the press. You know, you're going to get the bad when you get the good.
Well,
he's responsible.
And let me just tell you, 20 months ago, the CDC said the #1 threat to this country, military threat to this country, was a global pandemic. Then Donald Trump said, you know what, we're going to get rid of that department. That the people are saying that, you know, we need to be focused on these pandemics and whatnot. It is a failure of government to keep the people of the United States safe, regardless of who. If Donald Trump wants to take credit for everything, then he can take the blame for these kind of things. But I'm telling you right now, if we don't start taking these kind of things serious and taking science serious, we're going to see more and more of this. And the fact that we don't, when you ask the question, has Tennessee done a good job, or has the federal government done a good job? Guess what? We don't know, because we can't test anybody. We don't even have testing kits.
Now, hold on.
How is that even possible?
Well,
how is it even possible?
I can help you with that.
Thank you, please.
The New York Times did a story on that. It's done 2 stories, as a matter of fact, and here's why. American laws, American regulations, and American red tape. There's in Washington State, there was a group of physicians that wanted to do testing, and they were told they couldn't do, they were told by, and this is a bureaucratic maze, so I may get these initials wrong, but this is what happened. They were told by the FDA that they couldn't do their testing unless their lab was certified by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, but Medicare and Medicaid Services would not, the CDC would not allow Medicare and Medicaid services.
This is a post-coronavirus outbreak issue.
I'm giving you that.
But we should have the test kits in place. It doesn't have anything to do with the test kits.
These
are rogue doctors in Washington State. Those were rogue doctors doing whatever they.
Rogue doctors? No,
yes,
they were doing
totally
they were doing an influenza study,
and they wouldn't let them.
They wouldn't let them
that is our time, guys. We hope you